45 million. In 4 years. Not from war. Not from a foreign invasion. Not from a natural disaster that no government could have prevented. From a policy. A single set of decisions made by one man and implemented by the state apparatus of the most populous country on earth, decisions that Mao Zedong knew were producing mass death, that his subordinates reported to him in detail, and that he continued anyway. The Great Leap Forward ran from 1958 to 1962. It was Mao's program to transform China from an agricultural society into a modern industrial and communist state within a generation. It killed more people than any other non-wartime event in recorded human history. And for decades, most of the world did not know the full scale of what had happened, because China did not tell them, and because the Western academics and journalists who might have investigated were, for reasons that the historical record documents with uncomfortable clarity, often reluctant to look. This is the story of 45 million people. And the man who decided they were an acceptable cost. Mao Zedong came to power in 1949 at the end of the Chinese Civil War. The People's Republic of China he established was a country of approximately 550 million people, overwhelmingly rural, largely illiterate by the standards of industrial societies, and economically devastated by decades of war, colonial exploitation, and internal conflict. The challenge of governing it, of modernizing it, of transforming it into the communist society that Mao's ideology promised, was enormous by any measure. Mao was not a man who was deterred by enormous challenges. He was a man who had defeated the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who had led the Long March, who had built a revolutionary movement from nothing and brought it to power. He believed, with the certainty that successful revolutionaries often develop, that will and ideology could overcome material reality. That the right policy, implemented with sufficient determination, could transform an agricultural society into an industrial power within years rather than decades. The Great Leap Forward was the policy. It was launched in 1958 with two primary goals: to rapidly industrialize China through mass mobilization of its rural population, and to collectivize Chinese agriculture into massive communes that would, in theory, produce food more efficiently than individual farming. The industrialization campaign focused on steel production, the metric by which Mao had decided China's progress toward modernity would be measured. The Soviet Union had industrialized through steel. The United States measured its power in steel. China would produce steel. The method was the backyard furnace. Across rural China, peasants were ordered to build small furnaces in their villages and produce steel from whatever metal they could find: agricultural tools, cooking pots, door hinges, anything made of iron or steel. The goal was to produce enough steel in the countryside to supplement what China's industrial facilities could produce. The steel produced in backyard furnaces was, almost universally, useless. It was the wrong grade, produced at the wrong temperature, by people with no metallurgical training, from materials that included the tools they needed to farm with. The agricultural tools melted down to make steel in 1958 were not available to plant crops in 1959. The communes were the second pillar of the Great Leap Forward. Mao dissolved the individual farming plots that Chinese peasants had been allocated following the revolution and merged them into enormous collective farms, communes of thousands of households, in which all property was held collectively, all labor was directed by the state, and all food production was reported to and distributed by the commune leadership. The reporting was the problem that killed millions. Before the famine began, Mao launched the Four Pests campaign, a public health initiative that identified 4 animals as enemies of the people: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Sparrows were targeted because they ate grain. The campaign to eliminate sparrows mobilized the entire Chinese population, schoolchildren, workers, peasants, party officials, in a nationwide effort to drive sparrows from their perches by noise and prevent them from landing until they fell from exhaustion and died. Hundreds of millions of sparrows were killed. The ecological consequence was predictable to anyone with basic knowledge of agricultural biology. Sparrows did not only eat grain. They also ate the insects that ate grain. With the sparrow population decimated, insect populations, particularly locusts, exploded across Chinese agricultural regions. The locusts ate the crops. Mao was informed. The sparrow was eventually replaced on the 4 pests list by the bedbug. The locusts remained. If stories like this are new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The Great Leap Forward produced a famine. Not because of drought. Not because of flood, though both occurred in some regions during this period and contributed to the death toll. The famine was produced primarily by the system itself, by the specific way in which the commune structure, combined with Mao's production targets and the political culture of the Chinese Communist Party, created conditions in which grain was exported from starving regions while people died. The mechanism worked like this. The communes were required to report their grain production to party authorities. The production targets that Mao had set were unrealistically high, driven by the same ideological certainty that had produced the backyard furnaces. Local party officials who reported accurately, who said that production had fallen short of targets, that the harvest was insufficient to feed the population and meet state quotas, risked being denounced as rightists, as enemies of the revolution, as people who were sabotaging the Great Leap Forward with defeatism. The incentive structure pointed in one direction: report success. Local officials across China reported harvests that had not occurred. They reported steel production that was worthless. They reported the achievement of targets that had not been met. The reports traveled up the party hierarchy, each level adding its own optimistic gloss, until they reached Beijing as evidence that the Great Leap Forward was succeeding. Mao believed the reports. Or he chose to believe them. On the basis of those reports, China continued to export grain during the famine years, sending food to the Soviet Union and to other countries as evidence of Chinese productivity and socialist solidarity. The grain left China on trains while people in the regions it came from were dying of starvation. The people who died were not evenly distributed across Chinese society. They died in the countryside. In the communes. Among the rural peasants who had been the foundation of Mao's revolution, the people he had described as the vanguard of the Chinese Communist movement, the people whose liberation the revolution had been undertaken to achieve. They starved in the fields of a country that was exporting food. The death toll of the Great Leap Forward famine is the most debated figure in 20th century demographic history. For decades, the Chinese government did not acknowledge that a famine had occurred at all. The deaths were attributed to natural disasters. The true figures were classified. Researchers who attempted to investigate were denied access to Chinese archives. The figures that have emerged from the opening of partial archives, from demographic analysis, and from the work of historians, most significantly Frank Dicotter, whose 2010 book Mao's Great Famine drew on provincial archives that had become partially accessible, range from 30 million to 55 million excess deaths. The most widely cited figure among historians is approximately 45 million. To put that number in context, it is more than the total military and civilian deaths of World War I. It is more than the Holocaust. It is more than the combined death toll of every famine in recorded history before 1958. It occurred in 4 years. In peacetime. By policy. The Chinese government's current official position acknowledges that mistakes were made during the Great Leap Forward. It does not acknowledge 45 million deaths. The famine is taught in Chinese schools as a period of difficulty caused by natural disasters and Soviet pressure, a presentation that omits the specific policy decisions that caused it and the specific mechanism by which those decisions killed. The most disturbing aspect of the Great Leap Forward famine is not its scale. It is the evidence that Mao Zedong knew. Not immediately. Not in the first months when the reports of success were still plausible and the death toll was still building toward its catastrophic peak. But the evidence that has emerged from partial archive access suggests that by 1959, the worst year of the famine, Mao had received reports describing mass starvation in specific provinces. He had also received a direct warning from a senior colleague. In July 1959, at the Lushan Conference, a gathering of senior Chinese Communist Party leadership, Marshal Peng Dehuai wrote a private letter to Mao describing what he had seen during inspection tours of the countryside. The letter was measured and loyal in its framing. It did not accuse. It described problems. It raised concerns about the direction of the Great Leap Forward. Mao had the letter distributed to the entire conference. He then denounced Peng Dehuai as the leader of an anti-party clique, a rightist who was sabotaging the revolution. Peng was removed from his position as defense minister, subjected to political persecution, and would eventually die in prison during the Cultural Revolution. The effect of Mao's response to Peng's letter was immediate and catastrophic. Every party official in China who had been considering whether to report problems honestly had now seen what happened to the man who had done exactly that. The message was not subtle. The political cost of honesty was destruction. The political reward for continued reporting of success, however false, was survival. The famine accelerated. The reports of success continued. The grain exports continued. Mao did not reverse the Great Leap Forward until 1960, by which point the death toll was already in the tens of millions. Even then, the reversal was gradual and partial, driven more by the economic collapse of the Chinese state than by any acknowledgement of what the policy had done to the people it had been imposed on. The Great Leap Forward famine was not a secret to everyone. Western journalists and diplomats in China during this period observed the evidence of mass starvation and reported it. Their reports were largely discounted or ignored by governments and academic institutions in the West that were, for a combination of political and ideological reasons, reluctant to believe, or to publicize, evidence of mass death under Mao's government. The Cold War framing of the period created a dynamic in which acknowledging the full scale of Mao's failure seemed, to some Western observers, to serve the interests of anti-communist propaganda. The instinct to resist that propaganda produced, in some cases, a willingness to discount evidence that should have been taken seriously. The Western academics who visited China during the Great Leap Forward period and returned with positive assessments, who described communes that were productive and peasants who were enthusiastic, were reporting what they were shown and what they were willing to see. What they were not shown was people dying in fields 2 villages away from the model commune they had been taken to visit. The full scale of the famine did not become known to the international community until decades later, when Chinese provincial archives became partially accessible and demographic historians began the painstaking work of reconstructing what had actually happened from birth and death records that the regime had never been able to entirely falsify. Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976. He was 82 years old. He died in Beijing, in the leadership compound of Zongnanhai, as the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China. He was never tried. He was never formally accused. He was never subjected to the kind of accounting that the Nuremberg trials applied to the leaders of Nazi Germany or the Tokyo Tribunal applied to the leaders of Imperial Japan. The Chinese Communist Party's official assessment of Mao, adopted in 1981 and not significantly revised since, is that he was 70% correct and 30% incorrect. The Great Leap Forward is acknowledged as a serious mistake. The death toll is not specified. The famine is attributed, in part, to natural disasters. The specific mechanism, the reporting fraud, the grain exports, the destruction of Peng Dehuai for trying to stop it, is not part of the official account. His portrait still hangs on the gate of Tiananmen Square. It has hung there since 1949. The people who died in the Great Leap Forward famine have no memorial that the Chinese state has built. There is no museum, no day of remembrance, no official acknowledgement of the specific scale of what happened. Chinese citizens who attempt to research or discuss the famine in ways that contradict the official account face legal consequences under laws that prohibit the distortion of history. 45 million people died in 4 years. In peacetime. The man who made the decisions that killed them is on the currency. His face is on the money that 1 billion people use every day. And the world, which knows this, has not yet decided what to do with that knowledge.